What if every great civilization that ever rose was never truly the first, or the last? What if humanity's story isn't a straight line, but a circle, endlessly repeating, rebuilding, and forgetting? Imagine standing at the edge of a desert where wind carves patterns into ancient stone. Beneath your feet lie the remnants of cities that once thrived with voices, markets, temples reaching toward heaven. Now there is only silence. The sand has claimed everything. The names, the faces, the songs they sang. And yet, if you listen closely enough, you might hear something beneath the wind. A whisper, a rhythm, the faint echo of a pattern that repeats across millennia, across continents, across every corner of this world where humans have dared to build something lasting. We tell ourselves that history moves forward, that we are the culmination of progress, standing on the shoulders of those who came before. We believe our cities will endure, our knowledge will compound, our legacy will stretch into an unbroken future. But what if that belief is the very thing that blinds us to the truth? What if the story of humanity is not one of steady ascent, but of rise and fall, creation and collapse, memory and forgetting, played out again and again, like waves breaking on an eternal shore? Tonight, we journey into that pattern. We will walk through the ruins of civilizations that vanished without warning, explore the myths that speak of worlds before our own, and ask the questions that haunt the edges of archaeology and philosophy alike. We will consider the possibility that everything we think we know about human history is only the latest chapter in a book that has been written, burned, and rewritten countless times before. This is not a story of doom. It is a meditation on cycles, on the strange and beautiful rhythm that governs all things, seasons, stars, empires, consciousness itself. And as you listen, as your mind drifts between waking and dreaming, perhaps you will begin to see the pattern too. Perhaps you will recognize that the end of one world is always the beginning of another. The first clue lies buried beneath the earth, waiting in layers of sediment and stone. Archaeologists dig through time itself, peeling back centuries like pages in a book. And what they find is not a smooth progression from primitive to advanced, but something far stranger. They find gaps, sudden disappearances, civilizations that reached extraordinary heights and then vanished so completely that even their names were forgotten. Consider the Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished along the rivers of what is now Pakistan and northwest India more than 4,000 years ago. At its peak, it was home to millions of people living in planned cities with sophisticated drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, and a script that remains undeciphered to this day. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were marvels of urban planning, their streets laid out in perfect grids, their buildings constructed with precision that would impress modern engineers. And then, around 1900 BCE, it all ended. The cities were abandoned, the people scattered. No invasion is evident in the archaeological record, no great fire, no obvious catastrophe. They simply left. Or take the Maya, whose cities rose like stone dreams from the jungles of Central America. For centuries they built pyramids that touched the clouds, developed a calendar more accurate than the one used in Europe at the time, and created art of breathtaking beauty. Their astronomers tracked the movements of Venus with precision that wouldn't be matched for 1,000 years. And then, during the 9th century CE, the great cities of the southern lowlands were abandoned. Tikal, Palenque, Copan, all left to be swallowed by the jungle. The people didn't vanish entirely. They moved, dispersed, continued in smaller settlements. But the Golden Age ended abruptly, and the reasons remain debated. Drought, warfare, environmental collapse. Perhaps all of these, or perhaps something we haven't yet imagined. The pattern repeats across the globe. The Mycenaean civilization of Bronze Age Greece collapsed around 1200 BCE, taking with it the art of writing for centuries. The Akkadian Empire, the world's first empire, fell after 2 centuries of dominance, possibly due to a prolonged drought that turned fertile lands to dust. The ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest built elaborate cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, then abandoned them in the 13th century. Easter Island's inhabitants carved nearly 900 massive stone heads, then saw their society collapse as resources dwindled and the island's forests disappeared. Each of these civilizations left behind monuments that speak of ambition, intelligence, and sophistication. Each reached a level of complexity that took generations to build, and each fell, often rapidly, leaving future generations to wonder what went wrong. The ruins stand as silent witnesses to a truth we find uncomfortable: that advancement is not permanent, that complexity can unravel, that the things we build can be unmade. But here is where the story deepens, because when we look at the myths and legends preserved by cultures around the world, we find something unexpected. We find stories that suggest these collapses were not isolated incidents, but part of a much larger pattern. We find tales of worlds that existed before our own, worlds that rose to great heights and then were destroyed, making way for the world we inhabit now. The ancient Greeks spoke of 5 ages of man, each one ending in destruction. First came the Golden Age, when humans lived like gods, free from toil and suffering. Then the Silver Age, less perfect but still blessed. The Bronze Age followed, marked by warfare and violence. The Heroic Age gave us the legends of Troy and Thebes. And finally, our own Iron Age, the age of struggle and decline. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BCE, described this progression with a sense of loss, as if humanity had fallen from grace through successive cycles of creation and destruction. The Hindus conceived of time in vast cycles called yugas, each lasting thousands or millions of years. We are said to be living in the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and discord, which will eventually end in fire and flood before the cycle begins anew with the Satya Yuga, the age of truth and perfection. This wheel of time, the concept of eternal return, is woven into the fabric of Hindu cosmology. The universe itself breathes, expanding into existence, contracting into dissolution, then expanding again in an endless rhythm. The Maya, too, believed in cycles. Their long-count calendar tracked time in units called baktuns, and the completion of 13 baktuns marked the end of one world age and the beginning of another. This is what caused the misguided panic about 2012, a misunderstanding of the Maya concept of cyclical time. For the Maya, the end of a cycle wasn't an apocalypse but a transformation, a moment when the cosmic order reset itself and began again. Even the Abrahamic traditions contain echoes of this pattern. The story of Noah's flood describes a world so corrupted that it had to be washed clean, with only a remnant preserved to start anew. The Book of Revelation speaks of an end times followed by a new heaven, a new earth. These are not presented as unique events, but as fulfillments of a divine plan, suggesting that destruction and renewal are built into the very structure of existence. What are we to make of these stories? Are they merely metaphors, attempts by ancient peoples to make sense of natural disasters and social upheavals? Or could they be something more? Inherited memories of actual catastrophes that reset human civilization, passed down through generations until they became myth. The geological record offers tantalizing hints. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth entered a period of rapid climate change known as the Younger Dryas. Temperatures plummeted, ice sheets advanced, and the planet was thrown back into near glacial conditions for more than 1,000 years. What caused this sudden shift remains debated, but some researchers have proposed that a comet or asteroid impact triggered the change, possibly fragmenting over North America and causing widespread fires, floods, and environmental devastation. If such an event occurred, it would have been catastrophic for any human societies existing at the time. And here's the intriguing part. This period coincides roughly with the end of the last ice age and the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution, when humans transitioned from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agriculturalists. It's as if the slate was wiped clean and humanity had to start over, rebuilding civilization from the ground up. Could there have been advanced societies before this reset? Societies whose achievements were lost when the world changed? The idea seems far-fetched by conventional standards, yet it persists in the margins of archaeology and in the collective imagination. Plato wrote of Atlantis, a powerful civilization that sank beneath the waves in a single day and night of catastrophe. He claimed the story came from Egyptian priests, who said it happened 9,000 years before Solon's time, placing it roughly in the period of the Younger Dryas. Mainstream archaeology dismisses Atlantis as allegory, a philosophical device Plato used to explore ideas about ideal societies and their corruption. And perhaps that's all it is. But the story resonates because it touches something deep in human consciousness, the fear that everything we build can be lost, that our greatest achievements can vanish as if they never existed. Other legends speak of similar lost lands. The Hindus tell of Kumari Kandam, a continent that once existed south of India before being swallowed by the ocean. The Japanese have stories of Mu, a Pacific civilization that disappeared beneath the waves. Native American traditions speak of previous worlds that were destroyed by fire, flood, or ice before the current world emerged. These stories span cultures that had no contact with one another, yet they share common themes: advanced societies, sudden destruction, and the survival of a remnant who carried knowledge into the New Age. Are these stories evidence of actual lost civilizations, or are they universal archetypes, the human mind's way of processing the impermanence of all things? The answer may lie somewhere between. Perhaps there were no cities of crystal and gold, no technologies beyond our imagining, but perhaps there were societies more sophisticated than we've given credit for, societies that left few traces because they built with wood and fibre rather than stone, or because their remains lie beneath hundreds of feet of ocean water, submerged when sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. The coastlines of 12,000 years ago are now underwater. Vast stretches of land that were once habitable are now part of the continental shelf, buried under sediment and waves. If people lived there, and why wouldn't they have, given that coastlines offer abundant resources, then their settlements are lost to us, accessible only through expensive underwater archaeology that has barely begun to explore these drowned landscapes. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey has already forced us to reconsider what we thought we knew about prehistoric humans. This massive complex of carved stone pillars, arranged in circles and decorated with intricate reliefs of animals, dates to around 9600 BCE, before the invention of agriculture, before pottery, before metal tools. It was built by hunter-gatherers, people we assumed were too busy surviving to create monumental architecture. Yet here it stands, proof that our ancestors were capable of far more than we imagined. What else might we have missed? What other sites remain buried, waiting to challenge our assumptions? And if people 12,000 years ago could build Göbekli Tepe, what might they have achieved in the thousands of years before that? During the long stretches of the Ice Age when humans were already anatomically modern, already possessed of the same cognitive abilities we have today. The conventional narrative tells us that civilization began around 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, that everything before that was primitive and simple. But this narrative is based on the evidence we've found, not necessarily on the evidence that exists. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The Earth is vast and time is deep, and we have excavated only the tiniest fraction of what lies beneath our feet. So we return to the question, what if the cycle is real? What if human civilization has risen and fallen multiple times, each iteration building on the ruins of the last, each one eventually succumbing to forces beyond its control? What if we are not the first to ask these questions, but merely the latest in a long line of societies that reached for the stars and then fell back to Earth? The idea of cyclical time feels alien to the modern Western mind, which has been shaped by the concept of linear progress. We believe in evolution, in development, in the march toward an ever better future. This belief is relatively recent, a product of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, when it seemed that human ingenuity could solve any problem and that each generation would live better than the last. But for most of human history, and in most human cultures, time was understood differently. It was seen as circular, seasonal, eternal. The year moved through spring, summer, autumn, and winter, then began again. The moon waxed and waned in endless repetition. The sun rose and set, marking days that were fundamentally the same even as individual events changed. Life itself followed a cycle: birth, growth, decay, death, and then, through children, through the continuation of the community, birth again. This cyclical understanding of time wasn't pessimistic. It was realistic, even comforting. It acknowledged that loss was inevitable, but also that renewal was certain. The harvest would fail, but spring would come again. The king would die, but a new king would rise. The world might end, but a new world would be born from its ashes. The ancient Egyptians built their entire civilization around cycles. The Nile flooded every year, depositing rich silt on the fields and making agriculture possible in the midst of desert. This annual inundation was so reliable that the Egyptian calendar was based on it, and the prosperity of the kingdom depended on it. The Egyptians saw in this pattern a reflection of cosmic order, Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and harmony that governed all things. The pharaoh's role was to maintain Ma'at, to ensure that the cycles continued, that chaos did not overwhelm order. Even death was understood cyclically. The sun god Ra travelled through the underworld each night, battling the serpent of chaos, and emerged victorious each dawn. The deceased pharaoh became one with Osiris, the god of death and rebirth, and through proper rituals could be resurrected into eternal life. The pyramids themselves were not just tombs, but machines for transformation, designed to facilitate the king's journey through death and into the next phase of existence. The Aztecs took the concept of cyclical time to an extreme. They believed that the universe had been created and destroyed 4 times before the current era, each world age ending in catastrophe. The first world was destroyed by jaguars, the second by hurricanes, the third by fiery rain, and the fourth by floods. We live in the 5th sun, which will eventually be destroyed by earthquakes. To prevent this, or at least to delay it, the Aztecs performed elaborate rituals, including human sacrifice, to feed the sun and keep it moving across the sky. From our perspective, this seems barbaric, but from theirs it was necessary. They were maintaining the cosmic cycle, ensuring that the world would continue to exist. The Norse had their own version of cyclical apocalypse, Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. In this final battle, the gods themselves would fall, the world tree would shake, and the earth would sink into the sea. Fire and flood would consume everything. But after Ragnarok, the earth would rise again from the water, green and fertile. 2 human survivors would emerge to repopulate the world, and a new generation of gods would rule. The cycle would begin anew. These myths are not mere stories. They are cosmologies, frameworks for understanding existence. They suggest that the people who created them had observed the pattern of rise and fall, not just in nature but in human affairs, and had concluded that this pattern was fundamental, inescapable, perhaps even necessary. Modern science, interestingly, has begun to circle back towards cyclical thinking, though in different terms. Ecologists speak of succession, the process by which ecosystems develop, mature, and eventually collapse, making way for new ecosystems to emerge. A forest fire destroys the old growth, but it also clears the way for new plants to take root, and within decades, a new forest rises. The fire is not an aberration but part of the cycle. Evolutionary biologists recognize that mass extinctions, while catastrophic, also create opportunities. When the dinosaurs were wiped out 66 million years ago, mammals, which had been small, marginal creatures, suddenly had room to diversify and evolve. Without that extinction event, we wouldn't exist. Destruction and creation are intertwined, two sides of the same coin. Even in physics, we find cycles. The universe itself may be cyclical, according to some cosmological models. The Big Bang might not have been the beginning of everything, but merely the beginning of this particular universe. Before it, there might have been another universe that collapsed into a singularity, then exploded outward again. And our universe, billions of years from now, might collapse or dissipate, only to give birth to another. Time without beginning or end, existence as an eternal rhythm of expansion and contraction. But let's bring this back to human civilization, because that's where the pattern becomes most visible and most unsettling. When we look at the archaeological record, we see that civilizations don't just decline gradually. They often collapse suddenly, within a generation or two. Complex societies with elaborate hierarchies, specialized labor, long-distance trade networks, and monumental architecture can unravel with shocking speed. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE is a prime example. Within a few decades, the great powers of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, all experienced severe disruptions. Cities were destroyed, trade routes were severed, writing systems were abandoned. The Hittite Empire vanished entirely. Mycenaean Greece entered a dark age that lasted centuries. Egypt survived but was greatly weakened. The causes are still debated: invasions by the mysterious sea peoples, earthquakes, drought, internal rebellions, or some combination of all these factors. What's clear is that the interconnected system that had sustained Bronze Age civilization reached a breaking point and collapsed. The Roman Empire too fell with surprising rapidity in the West. In 400 CE, Rome was still the centre of a vast empire stretching from Britain to North Africa. By 476 CE, the last Western Roman emperor had been deposed, and the empire had fragmented into barbarian kingdoms. The infrastructure that had connected the empire, roads, aqueducts, trade networks, fell into disrepair. Literacy declined. Cities shrank. For centuries afterward, Europeans lived in the shadow of ruins they could no longer build, reading texts they could barely understand, surrounded by evidence of a greatness they had lost. Why does this happen? Why do civilizations collapse? The archaeologist Joseph Tainter proposed that societies become increasingly complex over time as they solve problems and adapt to challenges. But complexity has costs: administrative overhead, infrastructure maintenance, social coordination. Eventually, the costs of complexity outweigh the benefits. The society reaches a point of diminishing returns, where additional complexity doesn't solve problems but creates new ones. When a crisis hits, environmental, economic, military, the society lacks the resilience to respond. It collapses not because it's weak, but because it's too complex, too rigid, too invested in maintaining structures that no longer serve their purpose. Jared Diamond, in his book Collapse, identified several factors that contribute to societal collapse: environmental damage, climate change, hostile neighbours, loss of trading partners, and the society's response to its problems. Often, these factors interact in devastating ways. A drought reduces agricultural output, leading to food shortages. Food shortages cause social unrest. Social unrest weakens the government's ability to respond to external threats. External threats disrupt trade. Loss of trade further weakens the economy. The system spirals downward, each problem amplifying the others. But here's what's fascinating. Collapse is not the end of the human story in that region. People survive, they adapt, they simplify, they rebuild. The collapse of the Roman Empire didn't mean the end of people living in Europe. It meant the end of a particular form of social organization. Life continued, just in a different way, and eventually new forms of complexity emerged. The medieval kingdoms, the Renaissance city-states, the nation-states of modernity, each represented a new cycle of growth and organization. This is the pattern: rise, peak, decline, collapse, and then, after a period of simplification, rise again. Not in the same form, not with the same people, but following the same basic trajectory. It's as if civilization itself is subject to a kind of natural law, a rhythm that plays out regardless of the specific culture or time period. And if this pattern is real, if it's been happening throughout human history, then we must ask, where are we in the cycle? Are we still rising, still building towards some future peak? Or have we already reached the top and are now in the phase of decline, unable to see it because we're too close, too invested in believing that our civilization is different, that we've transcended the limitations that brought down all the others? The signs are there, if we're willing to look. Not with panic or despair, but with a clear-eyed recognition that patterns repeat, that what has happened before can happen again. Consider the environment. Every civilization that has collapsed left behind evidence of environmental degradation. The Maya deforested their lands to build cities and grow crops, leading to soil erosion and water shortages. The ancestral Pueblans of Chaco Canyon depleted their forests for construction and fuel, contributing to their eventual abandonment of the region. Easter Island's inhabitants cut down every tree on the island, destroying the ecosystem that had sustained them. The pattern is consistent. Societies exploit their environment to fuel growth, and when the environment can no longer support that level of exploitation, the society contracts or collapses. We are doing the same thing, but on a global scale. We've cut down forests, depleted fisheries, drained aquifers, and pumped greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at a rate that's altering the climate. The difference is that previous civilizations could collapse locally while the rest of the world continued. We've created a global civilization, interconnected through trade, communication, and shared resources. If our civilization collapses, there's no untouched region to carry on independently. The climate is changing faster than at any point in human history. Temperatures are rising, ice sheets are melting, sea levels are creeping upward. Extreme weather events, hurricanes, droughts, floods, wildfires, are becoming more frequent and more severe. These changes are already displacing people, disrupting agriculture and straining resources, and we're only at the beginning. The full effects of the carbon we've already released won't be felt for decades. This isn't meant to be alarmist, it's simply observation. The Earth's climate has changed many times before, and each time it has reshaped the conditions for life. The question is not whether change will happen, but how we will respond to it. Will we adapt, simplify, and find new ways to live within the planet's limits? Or will we cling to the systems and structures that are no longer sustainable until they collapse under their own weight? Then there's the question of complexity. Our civilization is the most complex that has ever existed. We have global supply chains that deliver goods from one side of the planet to the other. We have financial systems so intricate that even experts struggle to understand them. We have technologies that most people use daily but couldn't begin to explain. This complexity has brought tremendous benefits: medicine, communication, transportation, entertainment. But it has also created vulnerabilities. A single disruption can cascade through the system in unpredictable ways. A pandemic shuts down factories in one country, and suddenly there are shortages of computer chips, cars, medical supplies on the other side of the world. A cyber attack on a pipeline causes fuel shortages and panic buying. A ship gets stuck in a canal, and global trade slows to a crawl. These are small examples, brief disruptions that were resolved relatively quickly. But they reveal how fragile the system is, how dependent we are on everything working smoothly all the time. Joseph Tainter's theory of diminishing returns applies here. We keep adding complexity to solve problems, But each new layer of complexity requires more energy, more coordination, more maintenance. At some point, the system becomes so complex that it's brittle. It can't absorb shocks. A crisis that would have been manageable in a simpler system becomes catastrophic in a complex one. And then there's the social dimension. Civilizations don't just collapse because of environmental or economic factors. They collapse because people lose faith in the institutions that hold society together. When governments can't provide security, when economic systems don't deliver prosperity, when the social contract breaks down, people withdraw their support. They stop paying taxes, stop following laws, stop believing in the shared project of civilization. The center cannot hold. We see signs of this, of fragmentation today. Political polarization is increasing in many countries. Trust in institutions, government, media, science, religion, is declining. People are retreating into tribal identities, viewing those with different beliefs not as fellow citizens, but as enemies. The shared narratives that once bound societies together are fracturing into competing stories that can't be reconciled. This doesn't mean collapse is imminent or inevitable. Societies can recognize these warning signs and change course. They can simplify, adapt, redistribute resources, rebuild trust. But history suggests that this is difficult. Elites resist changes that threaten their power. Institutions become rigid and self-serving. People become invested in the status quo, even when the status quo is unsustainable. And so the society continues on its trajectory until something breaks. The Roman Empire had centuries of warning signs before it fell. There were economic crises, military defeats, civil wars, plagues. But the empire kept trying to maintain itself through the same methods that had worked in the past: raising taxes, debasing currency, recruiting barbarian soldiers. These measures provided temporary relief but didn't address the underlying problems. Eventually the system could no longer sustain itself, and it collapsed. Are we in a similar position? It's impossible to say with certainty. We might be in the early stages of decline, or we might be experiencing growing pains as we transition to a new form of organization. The future is not predetermined. But the pattern suggests that we should at least consider the possibility that our civilization, like all civilizations before it, is subject to the same forces of rise and fall. And here's where the perspective shifts, because if we accept that collapse is part of the cycle, then it's not something to fear as an ending, but to understand as a transformation. Collapse doesn't mean extinction. It means simplification, reorganization, the clearing away of structures that no longer work to make room for new ones. It's painful, certainly. People suffer during collapses. Knowledge is lost, lives are disrupted, the future becomes uncertain, but life continues. People adapt, and eventually they rebuild. The Dark Ages in Europe were dark only in the sense that we have fewer written records from that period. People still lived, loved, raised children, told stories, created art. They built new communities, developed new technologies, laid the groundwork for the medieval civilization that would follow. The collapse of Rome was traumatic for those who lived through it. But it wasn't the end of the story. It was a chapter break, a pause before the next chapter began. If our civilization were to collapse, and again, this is speculation, not prediction, what would come after? What would the next cycle look like? Would it be a return to simpler, more localized communities? A new form of organization we can't yet imagine? Synthesis of old and new, combining ancient wisdom with modern technology in ways that are more sustainable? The answer depends on what we preserve and what we let go. Every collapse involves loss, but it also involves selection. Some knowledge survives, some practices continue, some values endure. The people who live through the collapse carry forward what they deem most important, and that becomes the foundation for the next cycle. This is why myths and stories matter. They are the vessels that carry knowledge across the gaps, the bridges between one world and the next. When civilizations collapse, libraries burn and databases corrupt, But stories survive. They're told around fires, passed from parent to child, adapted to new circumstances but retaining their essential truths. The myths of flood and fire, of worlds that ended and began again, might be more than metaphors. They might be actual memories, encoded in narrative form, of collapses that our ancestors lived through and wanted us to remember. What would we want to preserve? What knowledge, what values, what practices would we pass on to those who come after? These are not idle questions. They're the questions that every generation should ask, because even if collapse doesn't come in our lifetime, change certainly will. The world our grandchildren inherit will be different from the one we know, shaped by choices we make and forces we can't control. Perhaps the lesson of the cycle is not to prevent collapse, which may be impossible, but to prepare for it, to build resilience rather than rigidity, to value adaptability over efficiency, to maintain connections to the land, to community, to the skills and knowledge that don't depend on complex systems, to remember that we are part of a pattern much larger than ourselves, and that our role is not to escape the cycle but to navigate it with wisdom and grace. But let's go deeper still, into the philosophical and even mystical dimensions of the cycle. Because if we're willing to entertain the possibility that civilizations rise and fall in a pattern, we must also ask, why? Is this pattern random, a product of chance and circumstance? Or is there something more fundamental at work, something woven into the fabric of existence itself? The ancient philosophers grappled with this question. Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher who lived around 500 BCE, famously said that you cannot step into the same river twice. Everything flows, everything changes. Fire transforms into air, air into water, water into earth, and earth back into fire. The universe is in constant flux, and this flux is not chaos, but a kind of cosmic order, a logos, a rational principle that governs all change. For Heraclitus, conflict and opposition were necessary for existence. Day and night, hot and cold, life and death. These opposites define each other and create the tension that drives change. Without destruction, there can be no creation. Without death, there can be no life. The cycle is not a flaw in the universe, but its essential nature. The Stoics, who came later, developed this idea further. They believed in a concept called ekperosis, a periodic conflagration in which the universe is consumed by fire and then reborn. This wasn't a one-time apocalypse, but an eternal cycle. The universe expands, develops, reaches a peak, and then contracts back into pure fire, only to expand again in exactly the same way. Every event that has ever happened will happen again, infinitely, in an eternal return. This idea was later picked up by Nietzsche, who used it as a thought experiment. What if you had to live your life over and over again, exactly as you've lived it, for all eternity? Would you embrace this fate or recoil from it? The eternal return was Nietzsche's way of asking whether we truly affirm life, whether we can say yes to existence in all its joy and suffering, creation and destruction. But perhaps the cycle is not just philosophical speculation. Perhaps it reflects something real about the nature of consciousness and evolution. Consider this. Consciousness seems to require contrast. We appreciate light because we've experienced darkness. We value peace because we've known conflict. We understand creation because we've witnessed destruction. Without these opposites, without the movement between them, consciousness might stagnate. What if the cycle of civilizations is a mechanism for the evolution of consciousness itself? Each civilization rises, explores certain possibilities, reaches certain insights, and then falls. The next civilization rises from the ruins, carrying forward some of what was learned, but also bringing new perspectives, new questions, new ways of being. Over vast stretches of time, consciousness evolves not in a straight line, but in a spiral, returning to similar themes but at higher levels of understanding. This would mean that collapse is not a failure, but a necessary phase in a larger process. Just as a forest fire clears away dead wood and allows new growth, just as death makes room for new life, the collapse of civilizations clears away ossified structures and allows new forms of organization to emerge. It's painful, yes, but pain is often the catalyst for growth. Some spiritual traditions go even further, suggesting that the cycle is intentional, guided by forces or intelligences beyond our comprehension. The Hindu concept of Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva represents this: Brahma the creator, Vishnu the preserver, Shiva the destroyer. But Shiva's destruction is not malevolent. It's necessary for the cycle to continue. Without destruction, there can be no new creation. The three gods work together, each playing their role in the cosmic dance. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's the concept of the bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth. It's a liminal space, a time of transition and transformation. What if the collapse of civilizations is a kind of collective bardo, a period when the old forms have died, but the new forms have not yet been born? A time of uncertainty and possibility, when the future is fluid and anything might emerge. These are not scientific theories. They're frameworks for meaning, ways of understanding our place in the larger pattern. But they offer something that purely materialist explanations don't: a sense of purpose, a reason to embrace the cycle rather than resist it. If we see collapse only as tragedy, as the end of everything we've built, then we'll spend our energy trying to prevent it, clinging to structures that may no longer serve us. But if we see collapse as transformation, as part of a larger rhythm that includes both endings and beginnings, then we can approach it differently. We can ask, what needs to die so that something new can be born? What are we holding on to that we should release? What seeds should we plant for the future, even if we won't live to see them grow? This doesn't mean we should welcome suffering or be passive in the face of injustice. It means we should recognize that change is inevitable, that the forms we've created are temporary, and that our task is not to make them permanent, but to ensure that what comes next is wiser, kinder, more aligned with the deeper patterns of existence. There's a concept in ecology called succession. After a disturbance, a fire, a flood, a volcanic eruption, an ecosystem goes through stages of recovery. First come the pioneer species, hardy plants that can survive in harsh conditions. They stabilize the soil, create shade, begin to build complexity. Then come the intermediate species, which require the conditions created by the pioneers. Finally, if enough time passes, a mature ecosystem emerges, diverse, resilient, capable of sustaining itself. But mature ecosystems can also become stagnant. They reach a climax state where change slows, where the dominant species crowd out newcomers, where the system becomes stable but also rigid. And then a disturbance comes, a fire, a storm, a disease, and the cycle begins again. Human civilizations follow a similar pattern. We start with pioneers, people who settle new lands or develop new ideas. They create the conditions for growth. Then comes expansion, increasing complexity, the development of institutions and hierarchies. Eventually the civilization reaches maturity, powerful, sophisticated, but also rigid and resistant to change. And then comes the disturbance, the collapse, and the cycle begins anew. But here's the crucial point. Each cycle doesn't just repeat the previous one, it builds on it. The soil enriched by the previous forest supports a richer ecosystem. The knowledge preserved from the previous civilization informs the next one. The spiral moves upward, even as it circles back. This is why the cycle is not pessimistic, but ultimately hopeful. Yes, what we build will fall. Yes, the civilizations we create will eventually collapse. But the human story doesn't end. It continues, transformed, carrying forward the best of what came before while leaving behind what no longer serves. And perhaps Over many cycles, over thousands or millions of years, consciousness evolves towards something we can't yet imagine. Perhaps each cycle is a lesson, a step in a journey whose destination we can't see from where we stand. Perhaps the universe itself is learning, growing, becoming more aware through the countless cycles of creation and destruction that play out across space and time. This is speculation, of course. We can't prove any of this, but we can't disprove it either. And in the absence of certainty, we're free to choose the story that gives our lives meaning, that helps us navigate the challenges we face with courage and grace. So let's return to the present moment, to the world we inhabit now, and ask, what does the cycle mean for us, here, today? We live in a time of extraordinary change. Technology is advancing at a pace that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. We carry in our pockets devices more powerful than the computers that sent humans to the moon. We can communicate instantly with people on the other side of the planet. We have access to more information than any previous generation could have dreamed of. At the same time, we face challenges that are equally unprecedented. Climate change threatens to reshape the planet in ways that will affect every living thing. Economic inequality is growing, with wealth concentrating in fewer and fewer hands. Political systems are straining under the weight of problems they weren't designed to solve. The social fabric that holds communities together is fraying. Are these the signs of a civilization approaching collapse? Or are they the birth pangs of a new form of organization, a transition to something different and potentially better? The answer may be both. Transitions are messy. The old forms break down before the new ones are fully formed. There's a period of chaos, of uncertainty, when it's not clear what will emerge. We may be living in that period now, the bardo between one world and the next. If that's true, then our task is not to prevent change but to guide it. To be conscious participants in the cycle rather than passive victims. To ask ourselves, what do we want to preserve? What do we need to let go? What kind of world do we want to create for those who come after us? This requires a shift in perspective. We're trained to think in terms of progress, of building toward a future that's better than the past. But what if the future is not a straight line, but a spiral? What if progress means not accumulating more, but understanding more deeply? Not building higher, but building wiser. Indigenous cultures around the world have maintained this perspective for thousands of years. They speak of 7 generations, the idea that every decision should be made with consideration for how it will affect the next 7 generations. This is cyclical thinking. It recognizes that we are not separate from the past or the future, but part of a continuous flow, receiving from those who came before and passing on to those who will come after. Many indigenous cultures also maintain a relationship with the land that modern civilization has lost. They see themselves not as owners or masters of nature, but as participants in it, subject to the same cycles of growth and decay, abundance and scarcity. They practice reciprocity, taking what they need but also giving back, ensuring that the land remains healthy for future generations. This is not romanticization. Indigenous peoples have faced their own challenges, their own collapses and transformations. But they've also demonstrated a resilience that comes from being embedded in place, from maintaining knowledge that doesn't depend on complex systems, from understanding that humans are part of nature, not separate from it. As our global civilization faces increasing instability, there's much we could learn from these older ways of knowing. Not to abandon technology or return to some imagined past, but to integrate ancient wisdom with modern capabilities. To build systems that are resilient rather than brittle, that work with natural cycles rather than against them, that value long-term sustainability over short-term gain. This is already happening in pockets around the world. There are communities experimenting with regenerative agriculture, which builds soil health rather than depleting it. There are architects designing buildings that produce more energy than they consume. There are economists developing models that measure well-being rather than just GDP. There are educators teaching children to think systemically, to understand connections and cycles rather than just linear cause and effect. These are seeds being planted for the next cycle. They may not prevent collapse. The forces driving our current civilization may be too powerful, too entrenched, but they offer alternatives, possibilities, ways of living that could flourish in the spaces left when the old structures fall away. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the cycle, that endings and beginnings are not separate but intertwined, that every collapse contains the seeds of renewal, that our task is not to cling to what's dying, but to nurture what's being born. This requires courage. It requires letting go of certainty, of the belief that we can control the future, of the need to know how the story ends. It requires trust in the pattern, in the resilience of life, in the creativity and adaptability of human beings. It also requires humility. We are not the pinnacle of evolution, the final chapter in the human story. We are one iteration among many, one cycle in an endless spiral. What we build will not last forever, and that's okay. What matters is not permanence but participation. How we show up, what we contribute, how we treat each other and the world we inhabit during our brief time here. The ancient Stoics had a practice called memento mori. Remember that you will die. It wasn't meant to be morbid, but liberating. When you remember that your time is limited, you stop wasting it on things that don't matter. You focus on what's essential. You appreciate the present moment because you know it won't last. Perhaps we need a collective memento mori. Remember that this civilization will end, not to induce despair, but to clarify priorities, to help us distinguish between what's truly important and what's merely urgent, to remind us that we're part of something larger than ourselves, a pattern that extends far beyond our individual lives or even our civilization's lifespan. When you stand in the ruins of an ancient city, Machu Picchu, Angkor Wat, Petra, you feel this perspective viscerally. These places were once alive with voices, with commerce, with the daily dramas of human life. Now they're silent, reclaimed by jungle or desert, visited by tourists who marvel at what was lost. But they're also beautiful in their decay, testament to the impermanence of all things and the enduring human impulse to create, to build, to reach for something beyond mere survival. We will leave ruins too. Future archaeologists, if there are any, will dig through the layers of our civilization and try to understand who we were, what we valued, why we fell. They'll find our buildings, our technologies, our art. They'll piece together our story from fragments, just as we've pieced together the stories of those who came before. What will they conclude? Will they see us as wise or foolish? As a civilization that learned from the past or one that repeated its mistakes? As people who face the cycle with courage or with denial? The answer depends on what we do now in this moment with the knowledge we have. We can't prevent the cycle. It's too fundamental, too deeply woven into the nature of things. But we can choose how we move through it. We can choose to be conscious participants rather than unconscious victims. We can choose to plant seeds for the future even as we acknowledge that the present is changing. We can choose to face uncertainty with curiosity rather than fear. The mechanics of memory. There's a particular kind of tragedy in the loss of knowledge, not the loss of a life, which is singular and immediate, but the loss of understanding accumulated over generations, refined through centuries, tested by time. When a civilization falls, it doesn't just lose its buildings and its borders, it loses its memory. Consider the Library of Alexandria, that legendary repository of ancient wisdom. The numbers vary depending on the source. Some say 400,000 scrolls, others claim as many as 1 million, but the precise count matters less than what it represented. Humanity's attempt to gather all knowledge in one place, to create a memory palace for civilization itself. When it burned, and it burned multiple times, in multiple ways across several centuries, We lost works will never recover. The complete plays of Sophocles and Euripides, treatises on mathematics and astronomy, histories of peoples whose names we no longer remember, gone, not just destroyed, but forgotten so thoroughly that we don't even know what we've lost. But here's what haunts me about Alexandria. It wasn't just the fire. The library had been declining for decades before its final destruction. Funding dried up, scholars left. The culture that valued such a place, that saw the preservation of knowledge as a sacred duty, had already begun to fade. The fire was merely the final act of a longer tragedy, the physical manifestation of a civilization that had stopped believing in its own future. This is how knowledge dies, not usually in dramatic conflagrations, but in slow erosion, in the gradual shift of priorities, in the moment when a society decides that maintaining the old wisdom is less important than addressing immediate concerns, in the generation that forgets to teach what the previous generation knew. The Dark Ages in Europe, misnamed, as we've discussed, but dark in one specific sense, saw the loss of tremendous technical and intellectual knowledge. The Romans had concrete that could set under water, aqueducts that moved millions of gallons with perfect precision, surgical techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered for 1,000 years. They had a postal system that spanned a continent, a legal framework of stunning sophistication, agricultural practices refined over centuries. And then, within a few generations, much of it was simply forgotten. Not everywhere, of course. This is crucial. Knowledge doesn't vanish uniformly. It retreats to pockets, to refuges, to the margins. While Europe fragmented, monasteries became arks of literacy. Monks in cold stone rooms copied manuscripts by candlelight, preserving texts they sometimes couldn't even read, in languages they didn't speak because they understood that memory mattered. They were the bridge across the gap, the thin thread of continuity between the classical world and what would eventually become the Renaissance. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad was gathering and translating the works of Greek philosophers, Indian mathematicians, Persian astronomers. They weren't just preserving this knowledge, they were building on it, extending it, creating new synthesis. When Europe finally emerged from its fragmentation, much of what it rediscovered came back through Arabic translations, knowledge that had been kept alive in a different civilization's memory. This is the pattern. Knowledge flows like water, seeking the lowest point, the path of least resistance. When one civilization can no longer hold it, it seeps elsewhere, finding new vessels, new guardians. The question is never whether knowledge can be preserved, it's whether there are people willing to do the preserving, and whether the conditions exist for that preservation to matter. Indigenous cultures understood this deeply. Without written language, they developed oral traditions of stunning complexity and durability. The Aboriginal Australians maintained songlines, navigational maps encoded in story and song, for tens of thousands of years. These weren't just directions, they were cosmologies, legal systems, ecological knowledge, all woven together in narratives that could be passed from generation to generation with remarkable fidelity. The songs contained information about water sources, seasonal patterns, the behaviour of animals, the properties of plants. They were living libraries carried in human memory. But oral traditions are fragile in their own way. They require unbroken chains of transmission. They need communities intact enough to pass knowledge down. When colonization shattered these communities, when children were taken from their families and forbidden to speak their languages, entire libraries burned, not in fire, but in silence. Knowledge that had survived ice ages and continental shifts vanished within a single generation. Now we live in an age of unprecedented information storage. We have more knowledge accessible at our fingertips than any previous civilization could have imagined. The entire library of Alexandria could fit on a device smaller than a book. We've digitized millions of texts, created redundant backups, distributed information across global networks. Surely we think we've solved the problem of memory. Surely our knowledge is safe. But is it? Digital storage is remarkably fragile. Hard drives fail. Formats become obsolete. The websites we built 20 years ago are already archaeological sites. Their links broken, their content lost. We call it link rot, this gradual decay of the digital world. But it's more than that. It's the same process that claimed Alexandria, just faster. We're creating more information than ever before, but we're also losing it at an unprecedented rate. And there's something else, something more subtle. We're losing the context. We have access to vast amounts of data, but we're losing the frameworks that make that data meaningful. A medieval monk copying a manuscript might not understand Latin perfectly, but he was embedded in a tradition that gave the text significance. He knew why it mattered. We have search engines that can find any fact in seconds, but we're losing the deep literacy that connects facts into understanding, that transforms information into wisdom. This is the paradox of our moment. We have more memory than ever, but it's increasingly shallow. We can access the surface of everything but struggle to go deep into anything. We've optimized for retrieval but not for integration, for storage but not for meaning. What gets remembered and what gets forgotten is never neutral. It's always a choice, conscious or unconscious, about what matters. The victors write the history, yes, but it's more than that. The powerful decide what's worth preserving. The dominant culture determines which languages, which stories, which ways of knowing get passed down and which get erased. When the Spanish conquered the Americas, they burned the Mayan codices, books of stunning complexity containing astronomical observations, historical records, mathematical knowledge. Only 4 survived. 4 out of thousands. The Spanish saw them as pagan, as dangerous, as obstacles to conversion. They couldn't read them, didn't value them, and so they destroyed them. And with them went knowledge we'll never recover, not just facts, but entire ways of understanding the world. This is happening now, in our time. Languages are dying at an astonishing rate, 1 every 2 weeks by some estimates, and with each language goes a unique way of categorizing reality, a distinct set of concepts and relationships, knowledge about local ecosystems and traditional practices. We're experiencing a mass extinction of human knowledge, and most of us don't even notice. But here's what gives me hope. Memory is more resilient than we think. It hides in unexpected places. It survives in fragments, in traces, in the margins of the dominant narrative. Archaeologists keep finding evidence that rewrites what we thought we knew. Linguists discover that supposedly dead languages left traces in the languages that replaced them. Geneticists find that populations we thought were wiped out actually mixed with and influenced later peoples. The cycle doesn't erase everything. It transforms. It recombines. It carries forward what's essential, even if the form changes beyond recognition. The question for us, living in this moment of potential transition, is: what are we choosing to remember? What are we fighting to preserve? And what are we willing to let go? Because we can't save everything. The attempt to preserve all knowledge equally is itself a kind of forgetting, a failure to discriminate between what's vital and what's merely interesting, between wisdom and trivia. Every civilization has to make choices about what matters enough to carry forward. Those choices reveal what we value, what we believe about the future, what we think is worth the effort of transmission. The monasteries that preserved classical texts through the Dark Ages didn't save everything. They made choices, often based on religious criteria that seem arbitrary to us now. But they saved something. They maintained the thread. And that was enough for the Renaissance to eventually pull on that thread and begin weaving again. We need to think like those monks, not in terms of their specific values, but in terms of their commitment to preservation even when the immediate utility wasn't clear. They copied texts they couldn't fully understand because they trusted that future generations might need them. They were good ancestors. What would it mean to be good ancestors now? What knowledge should we fight to preserve, not just in databases and servers, but in living practice, in communities of understanding, in ways that can survive disruption? What are the essential seeds that need to be carried through whatever transition is coming? These aren't abstract questions, they're urgent, practical matters. Because if the cycle continues, and everything suggests it will, then what we choose to remember now will shape what's possible later. The memory we maintain becomes the foundation for the next beginning. The psychology of endings. There's a cognitive bias psychologists call normalcy bias, the tendency to believe that things will continue functioning the way they always have, even in the face of evidence to the contrary. It's why people don't evacuate before hurricanes, why they stay in their homes as floodwaters rise, why they go to work on the morning of a coup. The mind struggles to accept that the normal patterns of life are breaking down. It's easier to believe that this is temporary, an aberration, that things will return to normal soon. Civilizations suffer from normalcy bias too, perhaps even more acutely than individuals, because civilizations are made of institutions, and institutions are designed for stability. They're built on the assumption of continuity. They have procedures for dealing with known problems, but they struggle to adapt when the fundamental conditions change. The late Roman Empire is a masterclass in civilizational normalcy bias. For decades, centuries even, the signs of decline were visible to anyone willing to look. The borders were increasingly difficult to defend. The economy was stagnating. The political system was producing emperor after emperor through violence and instability. The population was declining. The tax base was shrinking. The infrastructure was crumbling. And yet, life went on. The Senate still met. The games still happened in the Colosseum. The wealthy still built villas and threw elaborate parties. The bureaucracy still functioned, processing paperwork, collecting taxes, maintaining the fiction of imperial power. Because what else would they do? The Roman Empire was the world as they knew it. It had existed for so long that its end was literally unthinkable. There's a letter from Sidonius Apollinaris, a Roman aristocrat writing in the 5th century CE, that captures this perfectly. He's describing a dinner party, the food, the conversation, the literary games they played. It's charming and cultured and completely oblivious to the fact that the Western Roman Empire is in its final decades. Germanic kingdoms are carving up the provinces. The emperor is a puppet. The old order is collapsing. And Sidonius is writing about dinner parties. Is this denial? Decadence? Or is it something more human? The need to maintain normalcy in the face of overwhelming change? Maybe it's all three. Maybe they're not as different as we think. We judge the late Romans harshly for not seeing what was coming, for not acting to prevent the collapse. But would we have done differently? Are we doing differently? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. We're living through our own version of this. The signs of systemic stress are everywhere. Climate change is accelerating. Biodiversity is collapsing. Inequality is widening. Political systems are becoming increasingly dysfunctional. The social fabric is fraying. And yet, we go to work. We plan for retirement. We argue about trivial things on social media. We maintain the routines of normal life because the alternative, accepting that the fundamental conditions are changing, is too destabilizing to contemplate. This isn't stupidity. It's how human psychology works. We're pattern recognition machines, and the patterns we know best are the ones we've experienced. We have no experiential template for civilizational collapse, because it happens so slowly, across generations, that no individual experiences the full arc. What we experience is a series of small changes, each one explicable, each one manageable, each one not quite enough to break the pattern of normalcy. The psychologist Robert J. Lifton studied survivors of Hiroshima and found that many of them, in the immediate aftermath of the bombing, tried to maintain normal routines. They went to work, or tried to. They worried about being late. They apologized for their appearance. The mind, confronted with the incomprehensible, reaches for the familiar. Civilizational decline is different from a bomb. It's slower, more ambiguous, but the psychological response is similar. We normalize the abnormal. We adjust our expectations downward incrementally. We tell ourselves stories that make the changes seem less significant than they are. It's always been this way. Things were worse in the past. Technology will solve it. Someone will figure it out. These aren't lies exactly. They're coping mechanisms. They're how we maintain psychological equilibrium in the face of uncertainty. But there's a cost to this. The cost is that we don't prepare. We don't adapt. We don't make the hard choices that might ease the transition. We wait until crisis forces our hand, and by then, the options are much more limited. The Maya are instructive here. We know from archaeological evidence that they experienced a long period of environmental stress, deforestation, soil erosion, drought. The signs were there for generations, and yet the response was often to double down on the existing system. Build more monuments, conduct more rituals, intensify agricultural production, the very things that were causing the stress. Why? Because the system had worked before, because the monuments and rituals were tied to their understanding of cosmic order, because changing course would have required admitting that the fundamental assumptions were wrong. And that's psychologically very difficult, especially for the elites whose power and identity are tied to the existing system. This is the trap of success. The strategies that brought a civilization to prominence become sacred. They're not just practical approaches, they're part of the civilization's identity, its story about itself. To abandon them feels like betraying everything that made the civilization great. And so, even as conditions change, even as the old strategies stop working, there's tremendous resistance to adaptation. The Easter Islanders kept cutting down trees even as their island became deforested. The last tree that was cut, someone cut it knowing it was the last tree. What were they thinking? Were they in denial? Did they believe it would grow back? Did they simply not care about the future? Or were they trapped in a system where cutting trees was what you did? Where the immediate need outweighed the long-term consequence? Where the social pressure to conform was stronger than the individual impulse to preserve? We'll never know, but we can recognize the pattern. We can see it in ourselves. There's another psychological dimension to endings, the strange comfort of decline. This sounds paradoxical, but there's a relief in letting go, in accepting that you don't have to maintain the impossible anymore. The late Roman aristocrats, for all their denial, must have also felt the burden lifting. They didn't have to pretend the empire would last forever. They didn't have to solve unsolvable problems. They could focus on what was immediate and real, the dinner party, the poem, the conversation with friends. The Japanese have a concept called mono-no-aware, the pathos of things, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence. There's a beauty in autumn leaves precisely because they're falling. There's a poignancy in the cherry blossoms because they bloom for such a short time. The transience is part of the beauty. Can we apply this to civilizations? Can we find a way to appreciate what we have while acknowledging that it won't last? Can we hold both the grief of ending and the gratitude for what was? The Stoics thought so. They practiced negative visualization, imagining loss, contemplating impermanence, not to be morbid, but to fully appreciate the present. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his Meditations while the Roman Empire was already showing signs of strain, kept reminding himself that everything passes. All things fade and quickly turn to myth, he wrote. This wasn't despair. It was a way of staying present, of not taking anything for granted, of finding meaning in the moment rather than in the illusion of permanence. But there's a tension here, isn't there, between acceptance and action, between acknowledging impermanence and fighting to preserve what matters, between being a good Stoic and being a responsible citizen. Maybe the answer is that we need both. We need the wisdom to accept what we can't control, the fundamental nature of the cycle, the impermanence of all things, and the courage to act on what we can control, our choices, our values, the seeds we plant for the future. The psychology of endings is ultimately about how we hold paradox, how we live with uncertainty, how we maintain meaning in the face of loss, how we act with purpose while accepting that the outcome is beyond our control. This is hard. It's much easier to fall into denial or despair, to pretend everything is fine or to give up entirely. The middle path, clear-eyed acceptance combined with committed action, requires a kind of psychological sophistication that doesn't come naturally. But it's the only path that honours both the reality of the cycle and the dignity of human agency. It's the only way to be fully present in this moment of transition, neither clinging to a past that's gone nor fleeing into fantasies of a future we can't control. The Romans didn't have this wisdom, or couldn't access it. They clung to normalcy until normalcy was no longer possible. And then they were swept away by changes they hadn't prepared for. We have the chance to do better, not to prevent the cycle, that's not within our power, but to move through it with awareness, with intention, with grace, to be the generation that saw clearly, that chose wisely, that planted seeds even in the autumn of our civilization. In the year 476 CE, the last Western Roman emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed. History marks this as the fall of Rome, the end of the ancient world. But in the monasteries of Ireland, something else was happening. Monks were copying manuscripts. They were preserving Latin texts, maintaining literacy, creating illuminated gospels of stunning beauty. They didn't know they were saving Western civilization. They were just doing their work day by day, believing it mattered. This is how renewal actually happens, not through grand plans or heroic interventions, but through small groups of people maintaining practices, preserving knowledge, keeping alive the seeds that will eventually grow into something new. The Irish monasteries became centres of learning while Europe fragmented. They sent missionaries back to the continent, re-Christianizing and re-civilizing regions that had fallen into chaos. They brought books, literacy, agricultural techniques, organizational skills. They were the bridge between the Roman world and medieval Europe, the carriers of cultural DNA across the gap. This pattern repeats throughout history. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, destroying the House of Wisdom and throwing so many books into the Tigris that the river ran black with ink, it seemed like the end of Islamic intellectual culture. But the knowledge had already spread. Scholars had carried texts to Cairo, to Cordoba, to Samarkand. The network was distributed enough that no single catastrophe could destroy it entirely. When the Spanish conquered the Americas, they tried to erase indigenous cultures completely. They burned the codices, banned the languages, destroyed the temples. And yet, the cultures survived. They went underground. They mixed with Catholicism, creating syncretic traditions that preserved old knowledge in new forms. They maintained practices in secret, passing them down through families, through communities, through the very act of survival. This is the resilience of culture. It's not fragile in the way we often think. It's more like mycelium, the underground network of fungal threads that connects a forest. You can cut down all the trees, but if the mycelium survives, the forest can regrow. Culture works the same way. The visible structures can collapse, but if the underlying network of practices, values, and knowledge persists, renewal is possible. The Renaissance is the most famous example of this. We think of it as a sudden flowering, a rebirth of classical learning. But it was actually the culmination of centuries of preservation and transmission. The texts that inspired Renaissance humanists had been kept alive by Byzantine scholars, by Islamic translators, by medieval monks. When Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, Greek scholars fled west, bringing their libraries with them. They found an audience ready to receive what they carried, an audience that had been prepared by centuries of slow cultural work. This is the key: insight. Renewal requires preparation. The seeds need soil. The knowledge needs people ready to receive it, to understand it, to build on it. The Renaissance happened because medieval Europe had developed the economic surplus, the social structures, the intellectual curiosity to make use of classical knowledge. The seeds had been there all along, but they needed the right conditions to germinate. What are the seeds in our civilization? What are the practices, the knowledge, the values that need to be preserved through whatever transition is coming? Some are obvious, scientific knowledge certainly, medical techniques, agricultural practices, engineering principles. These are the practical seeds, the ones that directly enable survival and rebuilding. But there are other seeds, less tangible but equally important, the idea of human rights, the practice of democracy, the value of education, the commitment to truth-seeking, the appreciation of beauty, the capacity for empathy. These are cultural seeds, and they're more fragile than the practical ones because they require not just preservation but active practice. You can store scientific knowledge in books, but you can't store democracy or empathy. They have to be lived. This is where communities become crucial. The seeds of renewal are always carried by groups, not individuals. The Irish monasteries worked because they were communities with shared purpose. The Islamic scholars who preserved Greek philosophy worked because they were part of intellectual networks that valued and supported their work. The indigenous cultures that survived colonization did so because communities maintained their practices even under tremendous pressure. What are our communities? Where are the groups committed to preserving what matters? Where are the networks that will carry the seeds through the transition? They're everywhere if you look. There are communities working on sustainable agriculture, on renewable energy, on local resilience. There are groups preserving traditional crafts, maintaining indigenous languages, teaching ancient wisdom traditions. There are networks of scientists committed to open source knowledge, of educators working to maintain critical thinking, of artists keeping alive the human capacity for beauty and meaning. These aren't preparing for collapse necessarily. Most of them are just doing work they believe in, maintaining practices they value. But that's exactly what makes them effective. The Irish monks weren't trying to save civilization. They were trying to serve God and maintain their way of life. The preservation of civilization was a side effect. This is the paradox of intentional preservation. It works best when it's not the primary goal. When you're trying to preserve something for its own sake, it becomes a museum piece, static and lifeless. But when you're practicing something because it has meaning and value in the present, it stays alive, it adapts, it evolves, and that's what allows it to survive transitions. The concept of anti-fragility, developed by Nassim Taleb, is relevant here. Anti-fragile systems don't just resist shocks, they actually benefit from them. They gain from disorder. The human immune system is anti-fragile. Exposure to pathogens makes it stronger. Evolution is anti-fragile. Environmental stress drives adaptation and innovation. Can civilizations be anti-fragile? Can we build systems that gain from disorder rather than being destroyed by it? To some extent, this is what distributed networks do. The internet was designed to be anti-fragile, to root around damage, to maintain function even when parts of the network fail. Open source software is anti-fragile. The more people who use and modify it, the more robust it becomes. Biodiversity is anti-fragile. Ecosystems with more species are more resilient to disruption. The seeds of renewal are anti-fragile when they're diverse, distributed, and embedded in practice. When knowledge exists in multiple forms, in multiple places, maintained by multiple communities, it's much harder to destroy. When practices are lived rather than just recorded, they adapt to changing conditions. When values are embodied in communities rather than just written in documents, they survive transitions. This suggests a strategy for our moment. Diversify, distribute, practice. Don't put all the seeds in one basket. Don't rely on any single system or institution. Don't just preserve knowledge abstractly. embody it in communities of practice. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway is a beautiful example of this thinking. It's a backup for the world's agricultural diversity, storing seeds from crop varieties around the world in case of catastrophe. But it's not the only seed vault. There are hundreds of seed banks around the world, and beyond that, there are millions of farmers and gardeners maintaining crop diversity through the simple act of planting and saving seeds. The vault is important, but the distributed network is more important. The vault is a backup. The network is the living system, and if catastrophe comes, it will be the network, the farmers and gardeners who know how to grow food, who have the seeds and the skills and the community connections that will actually enable renewal. We need to think this way about all the seeds we want to preserve. Yes, store knowledge in libraries and databases, but also maintain it in communities of practice. Yes, write down the principles of democracy and human rights, but also practice them, embody them, pass them down through lived example. The seeds within the ruins are not just information, they're practices, relationships, values, ways of being. They're carried by people who believe in them enough to maintain them, even when the immediate utility isn't clear. They're kept alive by communities that provide the soil for growth. And here's what's beautiful. You don't need to preserve everything. You don't need to be responsible for the whole civilization. You just need to tend your patch, maintain your practice, keep alive what you value. The network will do the rest. The seeds will find their way to where they're needed. This is how renewal happens, not through grand plans, but through countless small acts of preservation and practice. Not through heroes, but through communities. Not through control, but through resilience and adaptation. The ruins of past civilizations are full of seeds. Some have already sprouted. The Renaissance, the Islamic Golden Age, the countless cultural flowerings that emerged from collapse. Others are still waiting, dormant, ready to grow when conditions are right. We're planting seeds now, whether we know it or not. Every practice we maintain, every value we embody, every piece of knowledge we pass down is a seed. The question is, are we planting wisely? Are we tending the soil? Are we creating the conditions for future growth? The responsibility of awareness. There's a weight that comes with understanding. Once you see the pattern, once you recognize the cycle, you can't unsee it. You're burdened with a kind of knowledge that most people, most of the time, don't have to carry. You know that civilizations fall. You know that ours is showing the signs. You know that the comfortable assumptions of progress and permanence are illusions. What do you do with that knowledge? This is not an abstract question. It's deeply personal, deeply ethical. Because awareness creates responsibility. Not the responsibility to prevent the cycle. That's beyond any individual's power, probably beyond any civilization's power. But the responsibility to respond wisely, to make choices that honour both the present and the future, to be what the philosopher Roman Ksnarich calls a good ancestor. What does it mean to be a good ancestor? It means making decisions with the seventh generation in mind, as the Iroquois Confederacy taught. It means planting trees whose shade you'll never sit under. It means maintaining practices and preserving knowledge not because they benefit you, because they might benefit people you'll never meet. It means accepting that your life is part of a larger story, a longer arc, and that your choices ripple forward in ways you can't predict or control. This is countercultural in our time. We're trained to think in terms of immediate returns, personal benefit, measurable outcomes. We're taught to optimize for our own lifetime, our own success, our own comfort. The idea of sacrificing for people who don't exist yet, who might not even exist in the form we imagine, feels almost absurd. And yet, this is exactly what our ancestors did for us. The Irish monks who preserved classical texts didn't benefit from the Renaissance. The scientists who developed vaccines didn't live to see the diseases eradicated. The activists who fought for rights and freedoms often died before those rights were won. They planted seeds they never saw grow. We're living in the shade of trees we didn't plant. We're benefiting from sacrifices we didn't make. We're standing on foundations we didn't build. And now it's our turn. Now we're the ones who have to decide what to plant, what to preserve, what to pass forward. But here's the paradox. We're living in a moment when the future feels more uncertain than ever. How do you plant for a future you can't envision? How do you make sacrifices for people who might not exist, or might exist in conditions so different from ours that our gifts are irrelevant? This is where wisdom traditions become essential, because they've grappled with this question for millennia. They've developed frameworks for thinking about intergenerational responsibility, for finding meaning in uncertainty, for acting with purpose even when outcomes are unclear. The Buddhist concept of the bodhisattva is instructive. A bodhisattva is someone who vows to work for the liberation of all beings, even knowing that this task is infinite, that it will never be completed. They act not because they expect to succeed, but because the action itself is right. The commitment is the point, not the outcome. This is a different kind of ethics than we're used to. We're trained to think consequentially, to judge actions by their results. But what if the results are unknowable? What if the time frame is so long that we'll never see the consequences? Then we need a different foundation for ethics, one based on values and commitments rather than outcomes. The Stoics had a similar approach. They distinguished between what's in our control and what's not. We can't control whether civilization collapses or how the future unfolds, but we can control our choices, our actions, our character. We can choose to act with virtue, with wisdom, courage, justice, temperance, regardless of the outcome. We can be good ancestors not because we know it will work, but because it's the right way to live. This doesn't mean passivity. It doesn't mean accepting injustice or ignoring problems. It means acting with full commitment while holding outcomes lightly. It means doing everything you can while accepting that the results are beyond your control. There's a story about a rabbi who was planting a carob tree. Someone asked him, "Why are you planting that?" "It takes 70 years for a carob tree to bear fruit. You'll never eat from it." The rabbi replied, "Just as my ancestors planted for me, I plant for my children." This is the ethic of the good ancestor. You plant knowing you won't harvest. You build knowing you won't inhabit. You preserve knowing you won't benefit. You do it because it's your turn, because you're part of a chain of generations, because the future depends on choices made in the present. But what if the future is collapse? What if the most likely outcome is that our civilization falls, that much of what we build is destroyed, that the people who come after us inherit ruins rather than flourishing? Does that change the ethical calculus? I don't think so, because even in collapse, even in ruins, the seeds matter. The knowledge preserved, the practices maintained, the values embodied. These become the foundation for whatever comes next. The Irish monks didn't know there would be a Renaissance. They just kept copying manuscripts, and centuries later, those manuscripts became the seeds of renewal. We're in a similar position. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know if our civilization will adapt and transform, or collapse and be replaced. We don't know what people centuries from now will need or value. But we can make choices now that increase the chances of positive outcomes, that preserve options, that plant seeds. This is the responsibility of awareness, to act as if the future matters, even when you can't know what that future will be. To be a good ancestor, even to people you can't imagine. To maintain hope without illusion. To take action without attachment to outcomes. To plant seeds without knowing if they'll grow. But there's another dimension to this responsibility. The obligation to tell the truth. If you see the pattern, if you understand the cycle, do you have a duty to warn others? Or is there wisdom in silence, in letting people maintain their normalcy bias, their comfortable illusions? This is a genuine dilemma. There's a cost to awareness. Once you see the fragility of civilization, once you understand the depth of our predicament, it's hard to maintain the routines of normal life. It's hard to care about trivial things. It's hard to plan for a future you're not sure will exist. The burden of awareness can lead to paralysis, to despair, to a kind of anticipatory grief that makes it difficult to function. Is it kind to impose that burden on others? Is it responsible to shatter their illusions? Maybe the answer is that different people need different things. Some people need to be shaken awake, to be confronted with reality, to be called to action. Others need to be allowed their denial, their normalcy, their comfort. The art is in discerning which is which, in meeting people where they are rather than where you think they should be. But there's a baseline responsibility to live in alignment with what you know, to make choices that reflect your understanding, to be an example of what it looks like to face uncertainty with courage and grace. You don't have to convince everyone. You don't have to save the world. You just have to live with integrity, to be true to what you see. This might mean changing how you live. It might mean simplifying, localizing, building resilience. It might mean learning skills, joining communities, preserving knowledge. It might mean having difficult conversations, making uncomfortable choices, going against the grain of the culture. Or it might mean something quieter. It might mean being present with what is, appreciating what you have, finding meaning in the moment. It might mean being kind, being generous, being fully human in a time of transition. It might mean creating beauty, maintaining relationships, passing down wisdom. There's no single right way to respond to awareness. The responsibility is to respond authentically, to let your understanding shape your choices, to be a conscious participant in the cycle, rather than a passive victim. And here's what I've come to believe. The responsibility of awareness is ultimately about love. Love for the world as it is, with all its beauty and fragility. Love for the people who will come after us, whoever they are. Love for the practices and values and knowledge that make us human. Love for the mystery of existence, the great cycle of creation and destruction that we're part of. When you act from love, the question of outcomes becomes less urgent. You act because you care, because it matters, because it's an expression of what you value. You plant the carob tree not because you'll eat the fruit, but because you love the idea of shade, of sweetness, of continuity. You preserve knowledge not because you know it will be used, but because you love learning, truth, the human capacity for understanding. You work for justice not because you'll see it achieved, but because you love the vision of a world where all beings are treated with dignity. This is the deepest responsibility of awareness, to let what you know deepen your love rather than harden your heart, to let understanding lead to compassion rather than cynicism, to let the recognition of impermanence make you more present, more grateful, more alive. We're living in a time of transition. The cycle is turning. The old order is showing its age. What comes next is uncertain. But we're here now with choices to make and seeds to plant. We're the ancestors of whatever future emerges. We're the bridge between what was and what will be. That's a profound responsibility, but it's also a profound gift. We get to participate in the great cycle. We get to plant seeds in the ruins. We get to be part of the story of how one world ends and another begins. And so we arrive at the end of this meditation, though of course it's not really an end, but a pause, a breath before the cycle continues. The civilization reset is not a single event, but an ongoing process, a rhythm that has played out countless times and will play out countless times more. We are living through one iteration of this pattern, and while we can't know exactly how it will unfold, we can recognize the signs, understand the forces at work, and make choices that honor both the past and the future. The great civilizations of the past, Egypt, Rome, the Maya, the Indus Valley, all believed they would last forever. They built monuments to eternity, created systems they thought were unshakable, told themselves stories of permanence, and yet they fell, as all things fall, making way for what came next. We are no different. Our civilization, for all its technological marvels and global reach, is subject to the same forces that brought down every civilization before us. Environmental limits, social complexity, the diminishing returns of growth, these are not problems we can solve through cleverness alone. They are features of the cycle, challenges that every civilization must face. But here's what's different about our moment. We have the accumulated knowledge of all those previous cycles. We have the myths and legends that encode their wisdom. We have the archaeological evidence of their rise and fall. We have the scientific understanding of the patterns that govern complex systems. We have, in other words, the opportunity to be conscious of the cycle in a way that previous civilizations may not have been. This consciousness doesn't give us the power to escape the cycle, but it gives us the power to navigate it with greater wisdom, to recognize when we're clinging to structures that no longer serve us, to let go of what needs to die so that something new can be born, to preserve what's essential and release what's not, to face the future not with fear, but with the understanding that change, even painful change, is part of the larger pattern of existence. The cycle teaches us that nothing lasts forever, but it also teaches us that nothing is ever truly lost. The knowledge of the ancient Egyptians influenced the Greeks, who influenced the Romans, who influenced the medieval scholars, who influenced the Renaissance thinkers, who influenced us. The thread continues, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, but never broken. Each civilization adds its verse to the song, and the song continues even when individual voices fall silent. What verse will we add? What will we contribute to the ongoing story of human consciousness? These are the questions that matter, the questions that give meaning to our brief time in the sun. Perhaps we'll contribute new technologies that help future generations live more sustainably. Perhaps we'll contribute new forms of social organization that are more just and equitable. Perhaps we'll contribute art and stories that capture something essential about the human experience. Or perhaps our contribution will be simpler, the recognition that we are part of a cycle, that our role is not to conquer nature or escape mortality, but to participate fully in the dance of creation and destruction, knowing that both are necessary, both are sacred. The stars above us have been shining for billions of years. They've witnessed the rise and fall of countless worlds, countless civilizations, countless forms of life. They'll continue shining long after our civilization has become a memory, long after our species has evolved into something else or vanished entirely. And yet, in this moment, we are here. We are conscious. We are part of the universe becoming aware of itself. That awareness is precious. It's what allows us to see the pattern, to understand the cycle, to make choices that ripple forward into the future. It's what allows us to create beauty in the face of impermanence, to love even though we know we'll lose, to build even though we know it won't last. The cycle will continue. Civilizations will rise and fall. The earth will turn. The seasons will change. The great wheel of time will keep spinning. And somewhere in that endless turning there will always be humans, or whatever we become, asking the same questions we're asking now. Why are we here? What does it mean? How should we live? The answers change with each cycle, but the questions remain. They're the thread that connects us to those who came before, and those who will come after. They're the proof that consciousness persists, that the search for meaning continues, that the cycle is not meaningless repetition, but an ongoing exploration of what it means to exist. So as you drift towards sleep, as your mind moves between waking and dreaming, let yourself feel the rhythm of the cycle, the rise and fall of your breath, the beating of your heart, the turning of the earth beneath you. You are part of this pattern, this ancient dance of creation and destruction, memory and forgetting, ending and beginning. The civilization reset is not something to fear. It's something to understand, to accept, to work with rather than against. It's the universe's way of renewing itself, of clearing away what no longer serves to make room for what might be. And in that clearing, in that space between one world and the next, there is possibility. there is potential. There is the chance for something new to emerge. What that something will be, we cannot know, but we can trust that it will come, as it always has, as it always will. The cycle continues, the story goes on, and we, for this brief moment, are part of it. Witnesses to the pattern, participants in the dance, carriers of the flame that has been passed down through countless generations and will be passed on to countless more. Rest now in that knowledge. Let it comfort you. Let it free you from the need to hold on too tightly, to control what cannot be controlled, to make permanent what is by nature temporary. The cycle will take care of itself. Your task is simply to live fully, to love deeply, to create beautifully, and to trust that whatever comes next will be exactly what needs to be. The civilization reset is not an ending, it's a transformation. And transformation, though it may be painful, is also the source of all growth, all evolution, all new beginnings. The cycle continues, the wheel turns, and somewhere in the darkness, a new dawn is already beginning to break.